It's now a matter of waiting for those last pockets of resistance to use up all their munitions. Iraqis already celebrating the liberation of Mosul from Islamic State militants after 3 years of occupation. But the retaking of Iraq's second city comes at a very high cost. Lives have been lost. Trust has been broken between Sunni, Shia, Kurdish, Yazidi communities. Can one of the world's oldest cities rebound? If so, how? What role for Baghdad? What role for outside players like the United States-led coalition and Iran? And then, of course, there's ISIS itself. The imminent fall of Raqqa in neighboring Syria could well spell the end of the so-called caliphate. But don't bet on an end to radical militancy. After Al-Qaeda, after ISIS, what will be the next incarnation for radical jihadism? And what's the antidote? As the 2001 chasing out of Osama bin Laden's forces from Afghanistan's capital shows, after winning the war, it's then about winning the peace. Today in the France 24 debate, after the Battle of Mosul, we'll be joined from Doha by the Brookings Institute's Ranj Al-Adin, who's penned an op-ed piece in The Guardian entitled "The West Cannot Afford to Ignore Iraq Once Again." Joining us from Boston, we welcome back Max Abrams, who teaches at Northeastern University, and he's a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations Center for Cyber and Homeland Security. Thanks for being with us.
Happy to join you.
Here in the studio, Julien Théron, he teaches at the French Political Science Institute Sciences Po, just back from Iraq. Thank you for being with us. And from Beirut, reporter and documentary filmmaker Carol Malouf Khattab. Nice to see you again, Carol.
Hello.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Now, we've had a statement this Monday made on national television by the Prime Minister. In that statement, we heard Haidar Al-Abadi saying it marked the collapse of the jihadist state. He said, quote, "I announce from here the end and the failure and collapse of the terrorist state of falsehood and terrorism, and which had been announced from Mosul 3 years ago." Of course, earlier in the day, it was obvious that it's not quite over yet. Gunfire still heard after nearly 9 months of grueling urban warfare. Claire Rush has more.
Gunfire rings out. In the narrow streets of Mosul, these Iraqi soldiers are still battling lone IS fighters, militants taking one last stand to defend their Iraqi stronghold from the coalition forces that launched the battle 9 months ago.
Our operation stalled because IS fighters were using civilians as human shields, especially women and children. This is why we advance so slowly. We must protect the civilians.
Sporadic strikes mark the end of a decisive battle in which 100,000 coalition soldiers challenged just a few thousand IS fighters in Iraq's second city. IS has lost a significant amount of territory over the last 2 years. But the war is far from over, according to the United States, one of the leaders of the coalition.
All eyes right now must remain fixed on the enemy of Daesh, which is not defeated. And Hawija alone will be a very complicated campaign.
The city of Hawija, south of Mosul, is still held by IS, as is the Syrian city of Raqqa, some 500 kilometers away. The battle to retake Raqqa began 3 months ago and is expected to be just as perilous as the Mosul campaign. IS still controls large areas of desert where it can retreat to and organize its operations.
And we are pleased to welcome the Brookings Institute's Ranj Al-Adin from Doha. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Your thoughts in the way that events have gone over the last, 24 to 72 hours inside of Mosul?
Well, I think the liberation of Mosul, the so-called liberation, was always forthcoming. It's been in the making for the past number of days. What essentially this means is that ISIS will no longer govern or control large swathes of territory. It will not govern northern Iraq like it has done over the past 3 years. But now the more difficult challenge of reconstruction, of rehabilitation comes. And that will be the next more difficult long-term challenge both the Iraqis, but also the international community will have to face.
We'll get to that point of reconstruction in a moment. Let me ask you, Julien Théron, we saw in that report the Iraqi military talking about the insurgents using civilians as human shields. How has this battle for Mosul, which has lasted 9 months, gone when you think to other cities that were liberated in Iraq?
Well, I think that it's a technique that has already been used elsewhere, in Fallujah or elsewhere. But you point something very interesting. It's the civilian case, meaning that the treatment of the civilians today will be of major influence of what will become of the city and of the rest of Iraq. Because if they are treated properly and with respect and with possibilities to evolve and with a proper political representation, it might be inclusive in the future of Iraq. But if it does not, if it's about harsh treatment, avenged regarding to the Shia militia, for instance, who have been accused, and the Prime Minister Al-Abadi said that he was going to ask for an inquiry regarding
and there's a precedent on that, which was the city of Tikrit, where when the city was freed, there were executions and summary executions.
Absolutely, and it was already to avenge a previous massacre from young Shia cadets from the Islamic State. So we see how things work. It means like cycles of violence, and if the Prime Minister really wants to break this cycle, he has to include the civilian population with a new, more democratic, more inclusive governance. But it's very hard because the Shia militia are very powerful today, and they are pushing to transfer this military advantage into political gain. So you see that the situation is pretty tense.
Carol Malouf, has the Iraqi government done a better job at protecting civilians this time around?
The civilians have always been caught in the fighting. There is a lot of skepticism. Unlike many others who see this as a rosy liberation, there are other people who are predominantly the Sunnis in the region who perceive this so-called liberation with skepticism, saying this is a mass exodus of the Sunnis from Mosul and from previously so-called liberated areas like Ramadi, Fallujah, Tikrit. All these predominantly Sunni areas have already, been totally neglected by the previous Maliki government, and now with this mass exodus of Sunnis from those areas, there is a lot of skepticism, as to whether they can come back. And we see that the Mosul and those liberated areas have been totally destroyed. I have personally visited areas in Tel Afar, in Sinjar, and in Shaddad in Syria, and I see how the aerial bombardment by the coalition has systematically destroyed most of the infrastructure in these areas. So how will these people be able to go back when there is no infrastructure, no water, no electricity, bakeries, most of their livelihoods, even the land, the crop doesn't grow anymore. So people are asking, how will these people be able to go back, and in what form? So I think there is a lot of skepticism from the Sunnis in Iraq specifically and in the region asking these questions. And if these answers are not raised very soon, I think we're going to see, as you pose the question, Al-Qaeda and then ISIS, and then what next? So if they go back to the desert and regroup and come back, I don't think we have seen the end of it.
Yeah, that is the fear, that those who haven't stuck it out may already have headed for the desert. There are plenty of places to hide in western Iraq, between Mosul and towns such as Tal Afar to the west towards the Syrian border, and Hawija to the south, where Kurds are on one side and Shia forces are on the other. Max Abrams, that those skepticism and doubt on the part of Sunnis that you heard described there by Carol Malouf, is it justified?
Well, I do think that there's an important sectarian component to understanding Islamic State, but I think at the same time it's very often overstated. For example, we were told that we wouldn't make progress against Islamic State in Syria until Assad was removed, and that turned out to be an incorrect prediction. We were told that in Iraq, until the popular mobilization units or forces, whatever you want to call them, until they were removed, we wouldn't see progress against Islamic State. Also, Islamic State's target selection has been all over the place. Again, sectarian grievances has not been a good predictor in terms of their target selection. If that were the driving force, we would expect ISIS attacks to focus much more on Shiite targets, but of course ISIS has been attacking all over the world. Furthermore, the sectarian explanation can explain variation in terms of the rise and fall of Islamic State. You can't use a constant methodologically to explain this kind of variation. And so, yes, I mean, the sectarian argument is of course very relevant, but I think pundits throw it around without thinking very scientifically about the actual relationship between sectarian grievances and the rise and fall in behavior of Islamic State.
Ranjal al-Din, do you agree?
I mean, I think there's always the danger of overstating sectarianism. But at the same time, I think, just to counter what Max just said, if the focus is simply on defeating so-called Islamic State, if the focus is simply on the military campaign, then the gains you end up making will not be sustainable unless certain grievances are addressed. Now, it's no secret and it's widely known that one of the ingredients that allows ISIS and other militant groups to organize, to mobilize supporters, to mobilize resources is in fact sectarianism. This isn't so much about the concept itself, but rather the perceptions among the Arab Sunni population in northern Iraq, and of course other sections of the Iraqi society as well. This isn't simply an Arab Sunni issue or concern. This is also a concern among other ethnic religious groups in Iraq that perceive the Baghdad government to be alienating, to be discriminatory, to have failed in providing services and security. Now, of course, coming back to the other side of the spectrum, whether you're an Arab Sunni in northern Iraq or a Shia in southern Iraq, in Najaf, for example, they have much in common when it comes to the Iraqi state. They lack access to services, they lack access to jobs, many are unable to provide for themselves, for their families, and ultimately it's these issues, in addition of course to things like sectarianism, that have to be addressed in order to make the military gains count in the longer run, in order to address essentially Iraq's crisis of authority and governance.
Ranj, just on that point, let me ask you, because back in 2003, when Saddam Hussein fell, there were neighborhoods of Baghdad that were effectively ethnically cleansed. Mosul, very cosmopolitan city with people from various backgrounds. What's it going to be like in the future?
Well, there isn't much left of Mosul. I think the UN estimates at least $1 billion worth of reconstruction is needed in Mosul, in northern Iraq, and according to them, billions more for more extensive reconstruction. Of course, cities like Mosul, and indeed others that have been destroyed during the course of this campaign that have suffered over the past 10 years as a result of occupation, as a result of sectarian conflict, Al-Qaeda in Iraq and so forth, these once used to be vibrant, pluralistic communities. Now, millions have been internally displaced. Towns and cities have been destroyed, as I said. Rebuilding communities, I think, will be the difficult part, because with reconstruction, you also need reconciliation. You need to address problems not just between the different factions, whether that's Arab Sunnis and Shias, the Kurds, but also internally among the different factions and communities that makes up the local populations. This will be a generational challenge, in my opinion. I don't think anybody should expect miracles in the coming days and months. This could be many years. And of course, reconstruction, the estimates that are being thrown around when it comes to the reconstruction effort assumes the environment itself will be helpful and conducive to that effort, because of course that can also be undermined by the expected ongoing instability, given that Iraq still is awash with armed groups, given that remnants of ISIS itself will continue to provide problems for the local population and the Iraqi security forces.
In previous shows, Julien Théron, we've talked with analysts who say that the Shias, it's not a given that they're, for instance, all pro-Iranian. Quite to the contrary. Many Iraqi Shias, much in the way that's been described by Ranj there, have said, hey, wait a minute, we're also nationalists, and they're first and foremost Iraqis. Some are openly hostile to the Iranians. What was your experience when you were recently in northern Iraq in terms of when you spoke to citizens?
I have to say that, first I agree what was just said, that reconstruction without reconciliation means nothing. It's the Afghan example, and that if everything that we built during the day is destroyed during the night by insurgents, it doesn't help in the situation. Regarding to sectarianism, you're right. All Shia are not pro-Iranian. During the Iraq-Iran war, there was a lot of dissensions, and even regarding to theology, there's a lot of differences between Shiism in Iraq and in Iran. But what I wanted to say regarding to sectarianism is that precisely that's the point. Do we have to look at the whole conflict as a sectarian conflict or not? Daesh would like that. It actually what it based its own ideology on. And I think that we are not obliged to do that at all. I think that the whole conflict in the Middle East is about the governance and not about sectarianism or religion. It's about how do we live together. So it means, and we have a good example for that. In previous years, during the civil war in Iraq, when Al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated, it was defeated mainly by the Sunni groups called Sahwa, Awakened. There's a lot of things to say regarding to their representativeness and so on, but still there were Sunni attacking radical Sunni, and it worked. Al-Qaeda was almost destroyed, few cells remained, and it restarted because of Shia, how could I say, persecutions in the country. So the Sunni thought that, well, if this is our only solution, and when ISIS arrived, Mosul fell down 3 years ago without a single fight, meaning that in order to prevent this sectarian conflict, we have to give the possibility, the political possibility, for all the communities to integrate. And what I've seen over there, and what was really striking, is that as far as I've seen, I'm not saying that it's completely representative, but what I've seen striking was the fact that Iraqis didn't tell me that they have any kind of Iraqi belonging. It was all about the sectarian belonging. The Yazidi thought, some Yazidi told me that they want an independent state in Sinjar. The Christians don't believe nor the Sunni, nor the Shia, nor the Turkmen, nor the Yazidi. The Kurds do not even agree one with the other regarding to the question of independence. So, I mean, like, they think throughout sectarian communities, not perhaps because they want to, but because, as a matter of fact, in Iraq today, it's a lot how the things are made, politically speaking.
All right, we're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Revisited, presented by Stuart Norval.
Youngstown, the legendary American Rust Belt city, immortalized by a Bruce Springsteen song of the same name. But the glory days of the steel industry are long over. Following the crisis in the industry in the 1980s, the city lost 2/3 of its population. Youngstown is now trying to create jobs by encouraging new technology startups. But deindustrialization, mass unemployment, and drug problems make development difficult.
Revisited on France 24 and France24.com. Talking Europe, presented by Yves Irvine. With all the main European news, debates between representatives of the best and worst performing EU member states, and exclusive interviews with major personalities. Talking Europe on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories that Tom Burgess-Watson's following for you in the newsroom. Donald Trump Jr. defends his June 2016 decision to meet with a pro-Putin Russian lawyer to hear allegations about the Clinton campaign. Allegations he says that discussion that he says went, quote, nowhere. Rex Tillerson's first foray into Middle East mediation kicks off in Kuwait. Over the next 3 days, the U.S. Secretary of State to visit both Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Paris metro service back to normal after Sunday night's record downpours. The equivalent of 3 weeks of rain fell in 1 hour on the French capital. And French President Emmanuel Macron at International Olympic Committee headquarters to make the case for Paris to host the 2024 Olympics. The IOC expected to endorse Paris's bid and give the 2028 Games to Los Angeles. Welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're speaking as Iraq's prime minister says that Mosul has been entirely freed from Islamic State militants after 3 years of occupation and 9 months of battle. With us to talk about it from Doha, the Brookings Institute's Ranj Al-Aldin. He's penned an op-ed piece in The Guardian saying the West cannot afford to ignore Iraq once again. From Boston, Max Abrams, who teaches at Northeastern University and who is a visiting, or is a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, not visiting, he's just a fellow on the Council on Foreign Relations Center for Cyber and Homeland Security. Julien Théron, who teaches at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po here in Paris, and from Beirut, reporter and documentary filmmaker Carol Malouf. For Mosul residents harrowed by their ordeal despite divisions laid bare by 3 years of occupation, the joy on Sunday was real.
We congratulate every Iraqi mother and our brave sons who are fighting for this country. We congratulate our brothers and sisters for the liberation of Mosul.
We salute all the Iraqi forces for saving our country and our families. We're very happy with such victories, in which we expelled the ISIS rats. We tell the people of the Mosul region that Iraqis across the country are supporting you.
May God bless the security forces. It was all thanks to their efforts. Now we are relaxed. But the people here are still suffering from the lack of water and electricity.
All right, so Carol Malouf, you have a contrast there. You have this nationalist pride, which is understandable after the end of a 9-month battle, as expressed by those residents of Mosul. And then you have what Julien Théron was describing just a few minutes ago, how people, well, they have a very strong sectarian identity at the end of this ordeal.
I'd like to pick up where Julien left off with the awakening councils or the Sahawat, which were predominantly the tribes who made the force that fought Al-Qaeda. But we also have to put it in its context. It was during the surge back in 2008, 2009, where the Americans promised more troops to defeat Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And in parallel, there was also political talks taking place with Sunni leaders, secret talks that were held in Turkey on the political level to convince the Sunnis after the de-Baathification in 2003 to go back to the political process. What happened was, it's true that the Sunnis defeated Al-Qaeda with the awakening councils. They were promised to be incorporated in the army, something which did not happen. On the contrary, the army was made more of Shia, Badr Brigade and Sadr Brigade. There was an imbalance in the army, a sectarian imbalance, which was perceived by the Sunnis as, they used to call it the Maliki army, and they used to perceive it as an oppressing force against the residents of the predominantly northern Sunni areas of Iraq. Now, when they went into the political process in 2009 in the Alawi-Tariq al-Hashimi alliance, and they won, the Sunnis they gave up weapons and took the political process seriously. When they won the elections, we all remember what happened. There was some kind of a political coup, and Maliki, Maliki's group, which came second in elections, for some reason or other, for political reasons that had to do with the Americans and the Iranians, they ousted Tariq al-Hashimi. He was labeled as a terrorist. He had to leave the country, and so did Alawi, which was a secular Shia. Since 2009, things went downhill. So the Sunnis they tried to go into a political process, with good faith. But when they saw that the table was turned in 2009 after the elections and the Shia had taken over government and the military, things fell apart. And I remember I was in Mosul, in Khazar checkpoint between Mosul and Kurdistan in 2014 when ISIS was happening, and the people who were coming out of Mosul, we were asking them what was going on, and a lot of them were saying that the people in Mosul were embracing the fighters against the Maliki oppressive military, and they were happy and celebrating that, the Iraqi army fled Mosul, and this was all documented in the media, and we did so as well. So the Sunnis wanted to be liberated from the Shia-dominated Maliki era back then. Of course, they were not expecting to get ISIS.
I was going to ask you, Carol, on that point.
Brutality.
I was going to ask you on that point, because now Iraq has a new prime minister. Now we've learned that lesson regarding the way that the Sunnis inside the army were sidelined. Is the new prime minister, is the new government doing better at addressing all of this?
Well, we have to talk to Athil al-Nujayfi and Usama al-Nujayfi. Athil al-Nujayfi is the Sunni governor of Mosul, and Usama al-Nujayfi is in government, and they both represent the Sunnis in government. I don't know how the Sunnis currently perceive this government, but I can tell you for sure that a year ago when I was there in Iraq, in Tal Afar, and we spoke to IDPs in different camps, it didn't seem like they were, very pleased with what the government was doing. And now with Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, or with the Shia militias, I think there is more skepticism from the Sunnis of Mosul, when it comes to central government. And we can also see the resentment by the Kurds also from the central government's performance, because now they are calling for a referendum to call for independence in September. So it looks like everybody is not happy with the central government, which is a predominantly Shia government, whether it's the Kurds or the Sunnis in Iraq at the moment.
Yeah, and the Yazidis as well, who are suspicious of the latter. Max Abrams, I want to come back now to the point you made in part one of our discussion, which is you can't predict the future when it comes to relations between these different communities.
Well, actually, you can make a lot of predictions about the plight of Islamic State. I've made tons of predictions, really, since day one. What my research has focused on, using data going back to, over decades all over the world, is basically what are the determinants of militant group success? What sorts of behaviors have propelled them to victory? Which ones are associated with failure? And based on these sort of trends, it has been very clear to me about the ultimate trajectory of Islamic State. The fact that it has imploded after 3 years is something that I've repeatedly been saying, because this is a group that has used violence very, very indiscriminately. And this sort of behavior is associated with militant group implosion, whether it's Al-Qaeda in Iraq, as some of the other guests have talked about, or whether we're talking about the GIA in Algeria, or frankly, even Western European groups that have basically overextended by killing too many civilians, like the RERA, the Republican group in Ireland, or whether we're talking about ETA's attacks. I do think it's important to use data and to have a wide sweep in terms of looking at the history of militant groups, because it can indeed help with predicting specific groups of today, including the plight of Islamic State.
I was going to say, Max Abrams, so you're saying that the use of indiscriminate violence can only get you so far in winning over public opinion. However,
yeah, I mean, it's really a surefire recipe for militant group failure. And
nonetheless,
one would really only know this if they were students of history. Many pundits basically overestimated the success of Islamic State. They like to talk about how gory the violence was and how excellent it was as a recruitment tactic in terms of bringing in foreign fighters from all over the world. But the net effect on membership size for militant groups historically of using violence indiscriminately is negative. It's unfortunate that so many people focused on selective examples of foreign fighters joining up with the group to join in the violence. The vast majority of people are repelled. And
So what is the next incarnation for radical militants then, Max Abrams?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think that we can make a distinction, many different distinctions. We could distinguish between Islamic State. We could distinguish between militant group activity more broadly. I do think that we should pause, though, and appreciate the fact that we've made substantial gains against Islamic State. Yes, it's true, Iraq is still a mess. Syria is still a mess. This is going to be true probably for decades. But we really have crushed the caliphate. This group will reconstitute itself in different forms. One trend, which is apparent from history, is that as government opposition focuses more and more on a militant group, that militant group has two choices. It could either stay and fight, in which case it'll get crushed, or it can decentralize. And that's really what we've seen with Islamic State. We've seen the decentralization of this group in response to government opposition. And I expect that to be a continued trend. And so as the caliphate implodes, more and more we're seeing foreign fighters disperse, attack locally. And so I expect to see more of that, basically a decentralization of this kind of violence.
Julien Théron, last month the Wall Street Journal reported on French special forces effectively tipping off the Iraqis to locations of French fighters who in some cases were captured and it appears summarily executed. What's your reaction to that, and how should a country like France, which has forces in that coalition, how should it behave regarding French nationals fighting for ISIS?
It's a huge dilemma for all European nations. The British as well ask themselves what they should do, and there's the same kind of story existing over there. There's no proper answer. The legal side of it is rather to consider them as fighters or not. So you might judge them, or you might just face them in combat and then kill them. So it's very hard strategic question. But what I wanted to react to this idea of the future of ISIS. In May 2016, meaning more than 1 year ago, they said that you can take back Mosul, you can take back Raqqa, and they said also you can take back Sirte, which has been taken back. And we will reorganize. We'll retreat, we'll reorganize, and I'm kind of convinced that actually all these military operations against ISIS are gaining time to allow the reorganization. I see two scenarios regarding to what might happen now. Rather, they keep in the shadow for a while and wait for another persecution of the Sunni and come back like ISIS did actually. Rather, they keep a state, because the Prime Minister said something very interesting. He didn't say, we took back ISIS territory. He said, this is the end of ISIS state, or simile state. The Taliban example is very interesting, because they still run an Islamic emirate in Afghanistan, in the shadow, a kind of shadow state of Afghanistan, with decision of justice and so on. So it's kind of two states, the shadow state and the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So it's an option for ISIS, actually. They might also perform from now on like that.
Ranjal al-Din, you agree?
Well, I think ISIS, given the infrastructure it's developed over the past decade, it still has a presence in key strategically important areas like Hawija, like Tal Afar, as your report, I believe, alluded to. It has a mafia-like system in place that will, in some form or another, allow it to continue to oppress the local population, to extort local businesses, to make the environment an unhealthy one for the reconstruction effort, for example, for stabilization efforts, for example. The question here is in what form will ISIS continue to assert its presence? I don't think it will quite reach the kind of Taliban-esque shadow system or state form, but instead it will continue to wreak havoc in the country through what it does best, and that is insurgency, tactics, IED attacks, terrorist atrocities.
South of Mosul and in Kirkuk.
And that relates, of course, to the mafia-type organization, the underground mechanisms that allows it to thrive and to function. The space that enables that still hasn't been suppressed. I think we disagree more on the semantics here. The question, of course, is how will the organization regroup? The remnants of the organization could potentially try to strike deals with the local actors, not necessarily in the coming days, of course, or even the coming months. The space right now is very restricted for it to do that. But let's say if the Iraqis and indeed the international community take their eyes off the ball once again, let's say things start to deteriorate from now, that space for striking deals, for partnering up with local entities, as it did in June 2014, that's how ISIS took control of northern Iraq and Mosul. It struck deals with local actors. Right now, it can't do that. But the question is, can it do that in the coming period, in the coming months and years?
Kara Malouf Khattab, there was one producer in the newsroom earlier who quipped that as long as there's an internet, ISIS will always be able to recruit more souls. Do you agree with that?
Yes and no. I think as long as there is injustice, I think ISIS will be able to recruit more. I think internet is just the tool of recruitment, but as long as there are people in the region, I've spoken as a journalist to a lot of these fighters. I've not gotten the chance to speak to any ISIS fighters, but I've spoken to Jabhat al-Nusra and Ahrar al-Sham and many of them in Syria, I used to think that it was poverty or ignorance, a lot of things that we hear, underdevelopment. But I realized that there were a lot of wealthy, highly educated people among them, and when you ask them, they will tell you, we came because we saw that there was injustice done. Whether we agree with that or not, I'm not, endorsing this in any way, but I'm just relaying a message that was told to me by one of their leaders. And they said, as long as we see that there is injustice done to these people, which they believe that they are the Sunnis, some of it is true of what they're saying, unless there is a reconciliation, as one of the other panelists mentioned earlier, there should be reconciliation and there should be some justice brought to people who have seen a lot of injustice over the past 2 decades. I think then we can start talking about the end of any insurgency in the region. Until this happens, I think we will see a lot of mutation, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or other groups that will emerge if the political situation remains the way it is in the region.
Development, stopping injustice. Max Abrams, is the government in Washington conscious of this? Is this something that's high on the minds there after the rekindling of Al-Qaeda in the form of ISIS?
I think it's a very dangerous and unscientific premise to say just very straightforward that Islamic State is a response to injustice. I think that approach is being an apologist for Islamic State, especially when you look at people being blown up in Western countries or all around the world. They obviously have nothing to do with committing injustices. And the people committing these attacks are complete political ignoramuses who are not really, responding to injustices. They generally don't have the first clue about what's going on in international affairs. I think that the real injustice is Islamic State itself, raping Yazidi women, blowing up mosques, blowing up basically anybody they can in any country at any time. And so this idea that we need to sort of broadly end justice to thwart Islamic State is actually kind of offensive to me.
Ranjal al-Din?
Well, I think you have to put it into context. This isn't so much about the concept of justice, but rather whether the structural conditions are there that allows ISIS to recruit a particular person, to get that individual to carry out attacks, to confront the government. If somebody in northern Iraq, whether that's in Mosul or elsewhere, has lost a family member or a friend, there is a grievance there and there is a sense of injustice. The question is who or what comes along to tap into that, to exploit that. Now, of course, there are injustices all over the world in developed societies that are undergoing conflict, that are safe and secure. But of course, what ISIS has done is exploit the sense of injustice that people feel. The fragility of the Iraqi state, of the Iraqi society, allows ISIS to come along with weapons, with the resources that allows for mass atrocities, and provides the tools, the outlet, essentially, to the individuals that have these grievances. This is a war zone, of course, and it's a heavily militarized environment where there's not only simply ISIS to deal with, but all sorts of armed groups, militias who are either committing acts of violence or who are perceived to be doing so, who are perceived to be sectarian. Now, if those conditions are there, if grievances are there, whether actual or perceived, they can be exploited. So I think, of course, that's how we need to look at the issue of injustice. Now, if, for example, there is a mechanism in place post-Mosul that allows people who have committed crimes to be held to account, but that also allows other actors to be held to account, not just ISIS or militant groups like it, also the actors that comprise the other factions, that comprise the various militia groups, for example. If there is a nationwide mechanism, consensus on how to deal with this issue of accountability and injustice, then only then truly can you move forward and ensure ISIS or its ilk or whatever comes after it does not exploit those fears to further its own objectives and goals.
All right, that call for accountability will be our final word for now. Ranj Al-Aldin, many thanks for joining us from Doha. I want to thank Max Abrams in Boston, Carol Malouf in Beirut. I also want to thank Julien Théron. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
We had a few false starts with the announcement of a victory in Mosul, the latest coming just a short while ago from the Iraqi Prime Minister himself.
Yes, and what's been interesting to see today is often with social media, it can be quite limited in its usefulness because, of course, it's only limited to 140 characters if we're talking about Twitter, and maybe you can attach a photo as well. But there are some really, really very shocking but very illuminating things being put on social media today, and these are just some of them. This, I thought, really summed it up very, very neatly: when liberation equals total destruction, and an image there of Mosul as it stands today. But you do get some very different views. This from Iraqi Day: good morning from the liberated Mosul, a man with a guitar singing. Very different pictures there, but from reporters who are embedded in Mosul right now, who've been tweeting long Twitter threads throughout this week, really, we get some really, truly enlightening insight into what has happened there. Rukmini Kalimaki from the New York Times says, "It's premature to say this operation is over. I'm sad to see that victory against ISIS came at such a price." Looking elsewhere at things that she's been saying over the last couple of days, this one really shows the twisted reality of life in Mosul right now. A Disney backpack with a white kitten on the front, a little pink backpack packed with explosives. It is an insight into what has become a very strange kind of normality for people in Iraq. Francesca Manocci, who is a freelance journalist who's been in Mosul for quite some time, tweeted this a little earlier on today at the Golden Division base, saying that Haider Al-Abadi, the Prime Minister, was about to announce the victory in front of the troops. And this message from her to really gives us an idea of just how much suffering has gone on. Obviously, we see the images of the destruction. This is a hint towards the personal suffering. Today in the old city of Mosul, I asked an Iraqi soldier, are civilians still inside? He started laughing and replied, they are all under the rubble. A very grim sort of humour, really, if you can call it that. But alongside the tweets and the reactions on Twitter, there are also a lot of long-form journalistic items out there right now to take a look at. This one actually dates back to February, but is being reshared again by BuzzFeed and by the writer Mike Giglio. And it is a look inside that golden division, as they are known. They were trained by the US to take on the terrorists. And this is a really interesting item. It was written in February, but certainly still is very relevant today. It details the brutal urban combat that they became involved in, but also the very close bonds that form amongst these fighters. He describes them as Iraq's best soldiers, the almost invincible killers of ISIS. The keyword there being almost, because one of the captains describes how he has lost every best friend he ever had in that fight.
This golden division, again, is it picking up on what we talked about earlier, that Iraq's army has learned from its past mistakes?
We will see, but I don't see any possibility to satisfy and to reconciliate if the Sunni are not brought back, including in the army, in political scene and the army. This Golden Division, for instance, these special forces, of course, they paid a huge tribute to and a lot of casualties and so on. And in the same time, all the reporters I talked to who were embedded with them told me that they were really strong in all the matter you can understand, like in the way they act. They're really like they act without pity.
All right. A merciless battle it's been. Julien Théron, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Emma James and the rest of our panel. I want to thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.